Okay, yeah. If you looked at that and said, "Hey, I was following along perfectly fine until we got to that slide," that's completely fine. Parsing and converting dates is just nuts. So you'll refer to that one-page guide, as I mentioned, and there's a ton of different options for converting between data types and parsing those dates. There's a link down below to a lot of those functions as well, but let's take a look at a few. Before we do that, just understand the fact that there are different types of data types that are stored within your tables. You could have numeric data like your integers, so somebody's salary could be stored as numeric, or you should have strings like their first and last name is like string data. As you saw the nuances there, you need to have those stored and you need to operate, if you're trying to do equivalency operators like name equals something, they need to be in single quotes. And then dates, again, are in that year, month, day format for BigQuery. Other values, of course, you can have your Booleans, your yes, no fields, and we'll introduce these last two in great detail in our architecture lecture as part of course 3, which is your array, which is kind of a series of values, and your structs, which are flexible containers. Don't worry about those two yet. Okay, so say you had to, you were given a data set that wasn't particularly clean, and you had to convert or treat data types as another before storing it into an ultimate reporting table. This is super useful for kind of transforming your data. How would you use that? So if you're familiar with a little bit of SQL, you also probably have ran into the cast or convert function. So in BigQuery and standard SQL, it's the cast function. So you have quotes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is a string of numbers. You want that to be treated as an integer. Boom, the result is then an integer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Or if you have something that's stored as 2017-08-01, treat that as an actual date and allow me to use these special functions that expect data in a certain type. Or if you want to convert it to string, or the bottom example is an interesting one. If you're unsure of the data that's coming in, so say you don't know that it's Apple, you're assuming that it's going to be you ask somebody to put in their, I don't know, their age or something like that. You're expecting it as an integer, and you're not doing any kind of, pre-filtering or validation. You can use something that like a safe cast. So instead of erroring out, you can basically say, well, I'm going to convert it, and if it doesn't match what I think it is, I'm going to actually have it be an empty value or a null. Now, nulls are super interesting, right? So they are valid values, but a null is the absence of a value. It's not quote quote. It's not an empty string, and it's not you know like if you hit the space bar once, it's not like just a single space. It is the absence of data. And then you'll see a lot more of that when we get into a lecture on joins, where you're actually merging two different data sets together. And when they don't have matches, then you actually have valid missing values or null values. So if you work a lot with data, you'll become very familiar with null values and actually how to deal with them when you're trying to match and just find those nulls. So let's get into a little bit of that now. If you want to match on those nulls, like for example, you want to find all of the values where the state is missing for these charities. Because you're saying, hey, well, if it's a US charity, it should have a state value. Now, you would normally think that if you're going to use an equivalency operator like state equals California or state equals New York, that you would use an equal sign. So nulls, again, super tricky beasts. They cannot be equivalent to anything, not even themselves. So you actually have a separate set of operators for nulls, and that's the is. So state is null or state is not null. So just be familiar with when you're using nulls, you'll be using the is. And there's special functions that handle nulls as well. So if you wanted to pass in data, and if it was null, then set it to 0 or something like that, there's those null functions as well that you can wrap around your fields. So for this state example, take a look at these. These are U.S. Charities, or at least the ones they're filing with the U.S., and they're missing the state value here. So we have some cities, Canada for some of these cities as well, but they're missing those state values, which is really interesting. So not all countries could necessarily be using a state value. So for example, maybe Canada doesn't use a state value, or Italy doesn't use a state value, much like the US would, but they're operating or at least doing business in the US. As we mentioned briefly before, year, or Y, month, day is the expected formats for dates, and that unlocks a ton of different date functions that you can then use on that date itself. So extracting the year, extracting the week, extracting the day, and that's the second row there. The extract function is very powerful. If you want to add or subtract or take the difference between two intervals of time, truncate, so you only want to look at the month or you only want to look at the year, or format it into a different format, you can do that as well. So once you get it into that proper date or date time data type, you unlock a lot of really powerful things that you can do. So dates, you're gonna have to. It's a necessary evil inside of SQL, but you'll get familiar with them. You can parse these string values. So for example, before we were just casting between values for data types. Now we can actually do some fun things like string manipulation functions. So you're probably already familiar with concatenation. So if you had two string values, much like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6, 7, 8, you could merge those two together. Or say you have two fields, one's a first name, another person's a last name. You could string together their first name and last name to get first and last name. Or if it just, a lot of these are kind of self-explanatory. If it ends with the letter E, then return true or false. A very popular one is convert everything to lowercase or convert everything to uppercase. So in the example we had way earlier on, whether or not it is school or is not school for our charities, you can think of, well, I don't know whether or not in my data set it's going to be capital Y or lowercase y. I'm just going to put everything to lowercase and then match on a lowercase y. So you would do lower parentheses, whatever the field name for was that school. I think it was like operates as school. And then you could set that equal to lowercase y. And that will allow you to not worry about guessing. And then, of course, you could use regular expressions in here as well.